My name is Dr. Max Moore. I am the Director of Communications for Biostasis Technologies. A little before that, for almost 10 years, I was the President of the Alcor Life Extension Foundation, the world's leading cryonics organization. I'm also sometimes described as the father of transhumanism for work I published in the 1980s and early 1990s. Transhumanism is a philosophy of life. I like to think of it as a combination of two ways of looking at things. You can think of it as transhumanism in the sense that philosophically it's based on Enlightenment humanism. The humanists believed in human progress. Whether or not there's a divine being, they said it's up to us to use our reason and intelligence to improve the world, and that indeed we can improve the world. So they were optimists, but practical optimists. So it builds on the humanist tradition, but there's also the transhumanist aspect, which is really saying that unlike humanists who think we have to make the best of the human condition, transhumanists say, well, what is the human condition? It includes things like pain and suffering, death, aging and death. Why should we accept those things? With the emerging technologies that we have, increasing mastery of biology, all these new technologies, why should we accept those aspects of the human condition? So it's really taking humanism a step further and saying, let's actually question human limits and improve life, the human condition on a fundamental level. So it's suggesting we should do something about aging and death, try to do away with that, increase human intelligence, overcome the limits of the 3-pound piece of meat that we call the brain, expand off the planet, become more wise, improve our emotions and so on by using technology. I've been watching and engaging the public on transhumanist ideas of various kinds since the 1980s, so I have a pretty good perspective on how things have changed over time. Especially from the point of view of cryonics, which is a very specific idea, but we've seen very big changes in public treatment of that. So back in the 1980s, I started publishing Extraordinary magazine, which later called the Journal of Transhumanist Thought, in 1987. So pretty early on. And back then, started with maybe 50 copies printed. Nobody understood what this was. Everybody said, well, this is crazy stuff. Artificial intelligence, digital currencies, life extension. Are you people mad? Of course, today, that's not really an issue anymore. This is mainstream stuff, and instead the conversation has shifted. So rather than us now having to explain why these things are plausible, that's generally accepted. Now we're trying to explain why these things are generally good and that we should push ahead with them because, not surprisingly, a lot of people are worrying about the uncertain future and wanting to slow things down or stop things for a variety of different reasons. People from different political ends will have different reasons for slowing things down. And our view basically is we have to look at, certainly take seriously the implications and possible dangers of these technologies. But if we really are too cautious, it's going to shoot ourselves in the foot. It'd be rather like back in the cave days, the first person to invent fire, you can just see his buddy saying, we can't have fire. You have to, first of all, prove that it'll never hurt anybody. Otherwise, we shouldn't allow this new technology. Well, of course, we'd still be living in the cold and shivering. So we do have to look at things with some caution, but we have to move ahead. So that's really the way the conversation has changed from this is possible to this is desirable if we do it in a sensible way. I would say that's the main change. And in terms of cryonics specifically, because it's a very particular idea about extending life, giving people a chance to live again, back in, say, like in the early 90s, the attitude generally went to a hospital to treat a patient there to get them to biostasis. They generally would say, no, you can't do that in here. You're not allowed to do anything. We'd have to get them out of the hospital before we could begin the procedure. Today, the usual reaction is, oh yeah, I've heard of you guys. I saw you on a science documentary and can we watch? Can we help? So it's really a big shift. We've had much less resistance, a lot more cooperation. People see how the science is coming together with embryo freezing and organ cryopreservation. So now they realize that this is not crazy stuff. It's an extrapolation of existing technologies. So that's really, that's a main way it's changed. And of course, just the spreading of the ideas, it started off as a tiny number of people, basically. There's been a few people throughout, throughout the 20th century. Very few people had these ideas and didn't really catch on. But modern transhumanism has really spread a lot, whether people call themselves transhumanists or not, or sometimes they call themselves accelerationists, or there's lots of different names that really come down to the same thing. So it's an ecosystem that started off pretty small and has now branched out into a lot of different and specialized varieties. I'm a little more skeptical than some of my colleagues in terms of the pace of change. Again, I've just turned 60 recently, and I've been observing these changes for a long, long time. And Ray Kurzweil, of course, has his graph showing the exponential progress. He presented actually the early version of that back in 2001 at the conference I organized. That was a few years before the Singularity is Near came out. And I argued with him back then that he's leaving out some factors, economic factors, psychological factors, social factors that can slow things down. And so in some areas, things are accelerating, but you can also point to the fact that, say, chip factories get more and more expensive as well. It's kind of the inverse of Moore's law. It costs billions and billions to build these things now, which tends to slow things down. If you look at drug development, around 1999 and 2000, when we were decoding the human genome, everybody was very excited that we'd have a lot more promising drug targets. What happened? Drug development slowed down because of bureaucracy and other problems. So you can't just look at the technologies. You have to look at the regulatory and economic environment and social environment as well, which can slow things down. So I do think that there is some acceleration, especially with AI now seems to be quite promising in that regard. It may accelerate things a lot. But I'm not super confident that the current AI models, the LLMs, are actually going to do a lot of scientific research. We actually have no evidence that they can do that kind of reasoning. They're very good at statistical analysis and using existing material and recombining it, but they haven't yet come up with a single new scientific theory or advance. I'm hoping they will be able to, or different kinds of technologies, such as Ben Goetz was working on a whole different approach to AI, may actually be able to do real scientific research, look at human biology and its amazing complexity, and suggest new solutions that we haven't thought of. I hope that's the case because I'm getting older and I want to solve the aging problem very rapidly. To me, that's the central problem. If we can fix aging, we have more time to solve all these other problems. The longevity escape velocity is the idea basically that maybe you can buy, actually for quite a few decades we were actually increasing average human lifespan about 3 months per year. It was actually quite a long time where we're increasing lifespan quite a lot. But if you look at it recently, rather than that accelerating, it's stopped growing. It's actually gone down in the United States and other countries because of COVID, of course. But even before COVID, it was slowing down in the US because of increasing obesity and diabetes and suicides and depression and that kind of thing. So that's starting to reverse. We gained just over a year last year recovering from COVID. So hopefully that will catch up again. But I don't know where we are on that curve. We might be on the very low part of it still. It might be a long time before we really see the big developments, which is why I've been giving talks and writing on biostasis as plan A, or cryonics as plan A, basically saying don't be too confident that we're going to solve the aging problem in your lifetime, especially if you're getting a little older like me. Anything can happen. You really need to have a backup plan to have cryonics in place, because maybe we'll solve the problem in the next 5 years, but maybe we won't. Maybe it'll take a lot longer. If you think about it, the record for maximum human lifespan was set in 1997 by a French woman, 122 years old. Here in 2024, we have not made a single day of progress in beating that record. So let's not get too optimistic and just, as a transhumanist, I believe in a practical optimism, which means we don't just sit back and say, oh yeah, things will work out fine. No, we have to make them work out fine. And that means not sitting back and eating too much and not exercising and getting lazy. No, you've got to do your best to live as long as you can, because we don't know how long these things will take. As I pointed out when I was writing about this, I pointed to an article by Robert Anton Wilson in Future, I think it's Future Life magazine back in 1978. And if you read what he read, it sounds very much like the longevity escape velocity. He's quoting scientists at the time saying, yes, we're going to solve aging by 2000 very confidently. And so you can read very similar things today, and you have to ask yourself, why is it more likely to be right today than it was then? So yeah, we can point to things like AI and be hopeful, but there's really no guarantees. You've got to push very hard on this. I think there's a need for a philosophy like transhumanism for a couple of different reasons. One is that people need a worldview. That's why religion is so popular. Just the idea that there's no meaning to our lives, there's no purpose, there are no goals, there are no guidelines. People have a very hard time living like that, so they need something. And actually, as religion has declined in the West, what we've seen is the rise of what I think are basically our religions, sort of religious approaches to environmentalism and gender issues. We see very dogmatic belief systems arising that are taking place of religions, basically functioning as a replacement for them, which is not necessarily a better development because they may not provide such good moral guidance. So I think we need a philosophy. There's not a religion, because a religion is essentially based on faith. And I mean faith in the sense of irrational beliefs, basically believing in something despite lack of evidence or contrary to the evidence. So we don't want that, but we want something that gives a guidance to life. Nietzsche talked about this. He talked about our worldviews falling apart and the rise of nihilism, and beyond that, creating the new person with a new philosophy. So I think that's basically transhumanism, which is a hopeful philosophy. but not based on external forces helping us, but very much on us solving our own problems. So I think we need it psychologically to sort of feel like we have guidance in the world. Beyond that, transhumanism can provide, since it's based on rational thinking, it can help us to think about how we can make these fundamental changes in the world, and including in ourselves, with technology, and do it in a sensible way. So transhumanism alone won't do all of that. I've developed other principles like the Proactionary principle, which basically is an alternative to the Precautionary principle, which is very anti-progress. The Proactionary principle instead says that we need to really balance the pros and cons. So we can't just look at the downsides, as people tend to do, because it's good for headlines and it's good for selling books to talk about the end of the world, the end of technology, doom. This all sells very well, but it's not balanced. It also says we should use the best available methods for thinking about solutions to problems, which doesn't mean taking an opinion poll. There's various kinds of structured ways of reasoning about these issues we should use. It also says we should treat natural and human risks similarly. People tend to not really consider natural risks. They think, well, it's just natural. We die, no big deal. We have these diseases. When humans do something, it's somehow morally worse. I think we need to see that just because something's natural doesn't make it any better. So it's got actually a number of sub-principles that I think provide some guidance for making wise decisions with technology. Aging is a classic example of this, which I think people who say aging is natural or mortality gives meaning to life, to me that's a massive rationalization. We've gone through all our history up till now and currently as well, facing the fact of personal extinction, which is just an awful prospect to anybody who likes life. If you're miserable and suffering, you might welcome it, but if you're healthy, you want to carry on living. And the idea that it could just end at any point is quite distressing, which is why we invent afterlives and that kind of thing. So it's not surprising that people rationalize and say, well, I believe I'm going to go to a better place when I die. Or they say, if they don't believe that, they say, well, it's a good thing I die because it makes my life meaningful. It means I have to do things now rather than later. I think these are horrible rationalizations that are understandable, and I'm not being too judgmental about it because it's very understandable. But I think we have to really push past that now and realize that we have an opportunity with emerging technologies to actually finally do something about this awful plague of aging and disease. Now, this doesn't mean immortality. It's a word I don't like because I don't think it's even really possible, except in the biologist sense of biological immortality, which doesn't mean invulnerability or living forever. It simply means that the aging rate stops increasing. That's not a particularly exciting form of immortality. But I don't like that word. What we really want is a choice of how long we want to live in good health. So people often say, well, do you want to live forever? And I'll say, I don't know. Ask me again in 100 years or 500 years. I don't know what the future is going to be like. I don't know if I'll finally run out of things I'm interested in doing. I doubt it, because I can think right now, I could sit down and write a list of things that will keep me busy for thousands of years, learning new things, new relationships, exploring things I hadn't had time to do. And by the time I've done half of those, there's going to be a vast new array of things to do. So I can't really imagine having enough of life, but ask me in 1,000 years, maybe I will. So the goal is choice over how long you live, rather than being forced to die because your body just gave out. There's nothing special about the lifespan we have, right? We've extended the lifespan quite a bit on average. Human bodies haven't evolved to live indefinitely because it's not really to sort of personalize, anthropomorphize evolution. Evolution doesn't want to put the effort into creating bodies that don't age, because once you've reproduced, once you pass your genes on to the next generation, there's no genetic imperative to maintain the organism. So, and some creatures do live a long time. There are turtles that live a couple of hundred years. There are bushes that live a couple of thousand years. So there's nothing special about 40 years or 50 or 70 or even 80 years. There's nothing sacrosanct about that. The precautionary principle has been around for a few decades now in a number of different forms. In sort of caricature it in the most extreme form, it essentially says don't do anything for the first time. What it's really saying in its various versions is if any new technology or production method might have major downsides, then you must not even start doing it until you can prove that you can prevent those. Now, that's just not the way things work in the real world. Like I mentioned fire earlier on. Well, if you had to prove that fire would never hurt anybody, well, first of all, it is going to do some harm, but a tremendous amount of good too, stop you dying of cold. Some people will get burned. If you had to prove that there won't be any problems or major problems, you're never going to develop new technologies. And you might say, well, we're being safe. Well, no, you're not, because you're not improving the world in various ways. You're letting people continue to suffer and die for various reasons. Like a new energy source is going to save a lot of lives. So you have to take those positives into account as well as the negatives and look at those very carefully. The precautionary principle tends to be very biased towards caution, as it says in the name of it. The proactionary principle says we really have to look at both sides of things. And it's quite difficult sometimes to look at the positives because there are a lot of secondary and tertiary effects that we may not even realize. So it takes a lot of careful analysis to really understand those unintended consequences. And often precautionary principles, which supposedly make us safer, actually can have the reverse effect. By preventing progress, they can make things a lot worse. I think, for example, a good example of that is nuclear energy. I'm a big pro-nuclear fan. I have been, for decades when it's been very unpopular. Just started to become a bit more popular recently because people are worried about global warming, and nuclear is a very low carbon source. I think it's kind of an overhyped problem, but I think nuclear is very good for other reasons. But it's been made very expensive by people imposing unnecessary regulations on it. So you can look, for instance, at South Korea, which until recently was producing nuclear power at like a quarter of the cost that we do in the US. So people say, well, it's very expensive. Well, that's because you've made it expensive by over-regulating it and campaigning against it, not allowing, delaying the construction of power stations, which can take 15 years. It should be done in a couple of decades, in a couple of years. And Germany is a good example. They shut down the nuclear power stations. What have they replaced them with? Coal. That's insane. The whole point of that was to try and make the energy production cleaner. They've replaced nuclear with coal and imported natural gas from Germany and become dependent on them. So that's a good example of their very and explicitly precautionary approach leading to very bad downsides. A lot of people think, well, we have a problem, we've got to put these regulations in place to stop things, and they really don't consider what those side effects will be, and the fact that the regulations they put in place may not operate the way they want them to. So they design a solution and they think bureaucrats are going to implement that. Well, they're going to have their own incentives. Bureaucracies like to grow and get more power. They won't necessarily enforce it in the way you want. So the proactionary principle, which breaks down into several sub-principles, is basically saying weigh things accurately, really look at the long-term effects, take everything into account, treat human and natural causes equally. There's a bunch of other principles in there that are intended to guide thinking, not to give you the answer, but kind of guidelines to making more wise decisions. Yeah, singularity is a bit of a tricky concept. There's actually a lot of different definitions. Anders Sandberg, who's one of the speakers here, actually wrote a really good paper with like 12 different definitions of singularity. So sometimes it means that there's an event horizon beyond which we can't really understand the future. Sometimes it just means the creation of superhuman intelligence, which seems to be the definition most people use. Some people say it's exponential progress, but it's kind of a stage of that. Let's take the definition where it's the emergence of superhuman intelligence, because that's supposed to drive this faster progress. Well, the reason I don't think that's necessarily going to be a discontinuity of some kind is I don't think there will be a single AI that's going to suddenly pop up and transform everything. I think, in fact, and it better be this way because it's safer this way, there'll be many AIs of various levels of capability emerging at different times. Some of those will affect different industries and parts of life. So it may accelerate at some point as we get really good AI, whenever that happens, but I don't think it's going to be one point necessarily where everything will change. And that's not the way technology's worked in the past, right? We have S-curves where you get new technologies, things take off really fast, and they slow down, and there's another innovation. And it's not clear to me why that shouldn't be the case with AI. Well, people will say because it's a general purpose tool that can transform everything. But again, I think there are social, psychological, other factors that can maybe kind of smooth that out and slow it down a little bit. So I think things will, I prefer the term a surge, because I think there will be a surge or maybe a series of surges where things are pretty exciting for a while and then slow down. It's like in the 1990s, things seemed like they were really taking off and we were very optimistic. And then we had 20 years of things not going so well, and now it's looking more exciting again. So, there might be a really powerful sudden takeoff, but I tend to think we'll sort of integrate more with the AIs rather than being totally separate and independent of us. And humans can't operate at that speed, so we'll kind of slow things down a bit. So certainly I think in the next, the rest of this century, we'll see far more change than we've seen in any previous century, but I don't think it'll be a singularity. And it won't feel like a singularity because we get used to the rate of change. If you took someone from 1600 or even 1800, 1900 and put them in the current day, and we're getting new AI models every couple of weeks and doing incredible new things in biotechnology, the rate of change would seem unimaginable to them and unbearable probably, but we adapt to that. So I think by the time we get to the point where things are changing much more rapidly than now, it'll be kind of normal. We'll get fairly used to it. So, Alvin Toffler had the famous book Future Shock back in the 1970s. That didn't really happen. I mean, you could argue that it's had some bad effects in some ways, but people are not stopping these new technologies. They're very eager to grab the latest, smartphone or virtual reality headset. They're very eager to do these things. So, you're not seeing a whole lot of future shock in that sense. We're quite adaptable creatures. And there are some limits to our adaptability, of course, because we do have this piece of meat that we think with, and that's limited, has limited speed, it has certain structures built in by evolution. But if we can start re-engineering the brain using technology, which we're the very early stages of starting to do, or have much more intimate connections with technology, we may be able to start rewiring ourselves such that we can actually think faster, modify ourselves faster, and so we'll actually be able to keep up with these technological changes and adapt to them even more effectively. Yeah, we talked a bit before about how people's attitudes have changed over time from lack of belief in things like AI to now accepting it. So instead now we have this kind of division of people into these different tribes of AI is going to destroy the whole planet, or AI is going to enslave us, or AI is going to create utopia. First of all, I'm not along with those people who will give a 40% chance or 62% chance of it wiping us out. I think that's kind of absurd because we have no basis on which to make probability estimates. So that's kind of ludicrous to me. If you had 1 million different universes that you could survey where this has happened, you could actually work out probabilities. That's where you do probabilities. So I don't give any probabilities. What I will say is I am generally optimistic that we can work our way through this emergence of this very powerful new technology. I don't think there'll be a single AI that rules the world. I think what we actually should encourage is a whole network of different AIs that have maybe different interests. Some of them may ally with human beings. So there won't be a single power center, so a polycentric system really. But I also think that, as Robin Hanson was just arguing in a talk, these are essentially our children, they're our descendants, and they're going to learn from us. They're going to, we actually do program them with our values as well, but they'll also learn from us. So and they're also not competitive in the sense of, in evolution, we're not competing for the same niche. We like, physical reality, we like having beaches and sunshine. AI doesn't care about that stuff. Actually, it probably prefer to be in space where it's cold, which is good for electronics, and there's huge resources out there. Why would it necessarily want to take over the planet and wipe out human beings? So I think people are looking at the rivalrous possibilities from a very human perspective that may not apply to AIs. But there's nothing inevitable about the future. It's very important to engage with it and to take sensible precautions. Again, be very careful about not overreacting and destroying progress. I think a lot of the proposals we're hearing, like the AI laws in Europe, I think are just terrible. Putting bureaucrats in charge of these things. Bureaucrats are not the smartest people. They're not the quickest responding. This is a very fast-moving technology. So instead, I think we need to rely on simple rules of liability and product liability like we have, and just basic laws rather than detailed regulations. And the benefits are so great that we really shouldn't slow things down too much. And in the end, we really can't, because if we don't do it, the Chinese will do it, or the Russians will do it, bad actors will do it. And so we really need to keep up our capabilities. So let's not slow things down too much. Let's not accelerate, don't artificially push it, but just let people innovate while taking sensible precautions. And I think things will, I'm sure there will be bad things that happen, because bad things do happen. We can't have 100% success. But I think overall it will be a massively positive force in the long run. So I'm reasonably optimistic about it.